9. On 28 March 1944, a tank commander of the 1st Armored Division holds at the approach to kilometer 19, a 90-degree bend in the highway south of Rome. His platoon has been ordered to assault the position, but every man in the column knows the order is a death sentence. The terrain itself is the fortification, and their previous tactics are failing. In open country, the M4 Sherman, a medium tank, uses combined arms tactics to overwhelm static defenses. However, the landscape here is dominated by ancient terrace farm walls, thick interlocking stonework called masserine, which channel the armor into narrow lanes. These lanes are all pre-sighted by guns hidden in stone farmhouses or case forte, which are impervious to their own 75mm cannons. The failure loop is mechanical and brutal, because the German Pak-40, a 75mm anti-tank gun, can penetrate the Sherman's 38mm thick side armor from over 800 meters. Any tank that attempts to climb or bypass the walls is destroyed. Even a brief 12-second exposure is fatal, which means the crew has no time to reverse or deploy smoke before the first round hits. As a result, the division is losing an average of 5 tanks every single day, a rate that has consumed nearly their entire operational strength in 9 weeks. If the commander obeys the order to push into the bend, his lead tank will be hit by the sighted guns, blocking the route for the entire column. If he waits, German 81mm mortars, already registered on his position, will saturate the column and force them to button up, breaking all cohesion. The only option left is to break procedure. He orders his column to tighten spacing to under 20 meters and attempt to rush the bend at full speed. He will trade radio discipline for momentum, hoping speed alone can outrun the German gunner's reaction time, so that at least one tank can get through the seam. In the next 20 minutes, the 1st Armored Division will commit its armor to the bend, testing whether speed can beat a defense that has, until now, proven unbeatable. How do you break a defensive system that turns your best weapon into a liability? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more battlefield analysis. To understand how the division ended up in this lethal, repeating trap, we must first go back. By March 1944, the American advance in Italy had frozen into a brutalist stalemate south of Rome. The initial optimism that followed the landings at Salerno and Anzio had dissolved, replaced by a grim arithmetic of daily attrition. For the men of the 1st Armored Division, the campaign had degenerated into a slow, methodical slaughter, not because of a lack of will or superior enemy armor, but because of the terrain itself. The landscape, ancient and seemingly pastoral, had been engineered by centuries of agriculture into the perfect anti-tank defense system. The German defenders, primarily veteran paratroopers, did not need to build extensive fortifications. The terrain already provided them. Their defensive doctrine was anchored on 2 key features: the case forte, ancient stone farmhouses, and the masserine, the low, thick stone walls that formed vineyard terraces. These were not the soft earth and root hedgerows of Normandy. They were dense, interlocking structures of field stone, often 3 or 4 feet thick and 6 feet high, built to last for generations. For the 1st Armored Division, they were lethal. The problem was one of physics and geometry. The M4 Sherman's own 75mm guns and the supporting 105mm artillery shells often failed to breach these walls, as the C-grade stone simply absorbed the impact of high explosive rounds. Demolition by combat engineers was suicidal. It required men to carry satchel charges across open ground, a process that took several minutes under the sights of German machine guns. Therefore, the tankers were forced to advance along the narrow farm tracks and vineyard lanes that snaked between these masserine. This geometry created perfect, pre-sighted kill zones. The German paratroopers were masters of this defensive warfare. They would allow a Sherman column to advance into a channel defined by 2 parallel terrace walls. Then, a single, expertly hidden 75mm Pak-40 anti-tank gun, itself often dug times into times. Another case forte, 800 meters away, would open fire on the lead tank. Simultaneously, 81mm GRW-34 mortars, with their fire solution data already registered on these lanes, would rain high explosive and smoke rounds onto the rest of the column, forcing them to button up and breaking all cohesion. A lethal vignette from March 12th illustrated the failure mechanism perfectly. A platoon from the 1st Tank Battalion was ordered to clear a lane designated Route 4 Alpha, which was anchored by a 2-story stone farmhouse. The lead Sherman, call sign Baker 2, attempted to bypass the main house by climbing the edge of a masserine that formed its vineyard boundary. For just 12 seconds, the tank maneuvered, its weight shifting as it tried to gain purchase on the collapsing stone. This maneuver, however, exposed its thinner 38mm thick side armor to a known enemy strongpoint on the adjacent hill. A single PaK-40, silent until that moment, fired one armor-piercing round from 700 meters. The shot penetrated the side armor, instantly igniting the ammunition stored in the sponson. The Sherman brewed up, a catastrophic explosion that killed 3 of the 5 crewmen. But the tactical disaster was larger than the loss of one tank. The burning wreck now sat perpendicular to the lane, completely blocking Route 4 Alpha. It took the recovery teams over 6 hours until 17:30 that evening to clear the path under intermittent mortar fire. The attack was over, the objective had not been taken, and 2 more tanks were damaged, attempting to retrieve the first. This was the pattern. The existing doctrine of artillery bombardment followed by a frontal armored assault was not just failing, it was feeding American armor into a meat grinder designed by medieval farmers and perfected by German paratroopers. The losses had become unsustainable, and the road to Rome remained firmly blocked. The crisis was not just tactical, it was mathematical. By the final week of March 1944, the 1st Armored Division's own after-action reports painted a catastrophic picture. The division had suffered the loss of over 280 M4 Sherman tanks in the preceding 9 weeks of combat. This figure represented a near-total turnover of their operational strength. When broken down, the statistic was even more grim. It was an average loss of nearly 5 tanks every single day, Sunday included. 5 crews, 5 vehicles, lost to the same intractable terrain, often on the same few kilometers of contested road. The advance toward Rome had not just stalled, it was being systematically disassembled, 1 tank platoon at a time. This pattern of destruction was uniquely visible to one man, Sergeant Leo Harris. Harris was not a line commander. He was a tank recovery specialist assigned to the 1st Armored Division's Ordnance Battalion. His job began when the fight was over. He and his crew operated the heavy M32 tank recovery vehicles, tasked with retrieving the battlefield damaged or combat lost assets. In reality, his job was to drive into the kill zones, described in radio reports the same vineyard lanes and farmhouse approaches to assess the wrecks. He saw the results of the Case Forte defenses every day. He was the one who had to hook up the tow cables to the burnt-out hull of Baker 2. The tank lost on March 12th. He saw the neat 75mm caliber hole in its 38mm side plate. He saw the other wrecks, many with their thinner belly or side armor perforated, all of them caught in the channels of the masserine. Harris's unique perspective gave him a data set of failure that no one else possessed. He understood, in purely mechanical terms, how the division was dying. The division was not without other solutions, but they had all proven to be failures. The most logical approach was to use combat engineers, the sappers, to destroy the stone walls with demolitions. The standard issue satchel charge, however, was insufficient. To breach a 4-foot-thick stone wall, engineers needed to hand-place massive charges of C2, a powerful and stable plastic explosive. This was the core of the problem. Placing the charges required the sapper team to leave their cover, run 30 or 40 meters to the wall, emplace the charge and fuse, and return a process that, even when perfectly executed, took a minimum of 3 minutes. In the pre-cited, machine gun-swept kill zones of the Fallschirmjäger, 3 minutes was an eternity. The division had lost nearly a dozen engineers in the first week of March attempting this exact tactic. As a result, the engineers could only work at night, slowing the advance to a crawl, or not at all. The spark of innovation came to Harris on March 21st, during a stalled recovery operation. An engineer team was working to clear a different kind of obstacle, a downed bridge abutment blocking his M32. Harris watched as two engineers, under the cover of smoke, placed a 40-pound C2 charge. The resulting blast was terrifyingly efficient, pulverizing the concrete and clearing the path in an instant. Harris stared at the cloud of stone dust, a realization forming. The problem was not the explosive. The C2 worked perfectly. The problem was not the stone. The C2 could clearly destroy it. The problem was delivery. The engineers were dying because they were delivering the charge on foot. He, on the other hand, commanded a 30-ton armored vehicle. He returned to the maintenance depot that evening. He pulled a technical manual for the Sherman and a grease pencil. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a mechanic, and he understood steel, weight, and force. He began sketching, not a new tank, but a new tool, a mechanism that could deliver the explosive power of C2 from the relative safety of an M4 Sherman without forcing the crew to stop and become a target. He was designing a way to weaponize the tank, not just as a gun platform, but as a delivery system for demolition. Sergeant Harris was a mechanic, not an ordnance designer, but his idea consumed him. He co-opted two other men from his recovery section, a private named Cohen, who was a notoriously skilled welder, and a corporal named Varga, who had been a demolition specialist in a pre-war life. Working after their shifts, using scavenged materials and requisitions they creatively misfiled, they began to build the first prototype. Their device was a monster of field expediency. They started with a 10-foot section of heavy-gauge steel pipe, salvaged from a destroyed German culvert. Cohen, the welder, fabricated a crude steel cradle and mounting bracket, which he welded directly to the bow plate of Harris's own M32 recovery vehicle, which was built on a Sherman chassis. The pipe was designed to rest in this cradle, angled slightly upward. Corporal Varga then carefully packed the pipe with 40 pounds of C2 explosive, tamping it around a simple detonation train, ending in a 3-second cord fuse. They christened it the Dragon's Tooth, a fitting name for a device intended to bite through stone. The operational concept was simple and deeply flawed. Harris planned to drive the tank directly up to a target wall, use the tank's momentum to push the 10-foot pipe into the stone, light the fuse by hand, and then have his driver throw the tank into a hard reverse for the 3 seconds before detonation. It was a plan that left no margin for error, a 3-second window to reverse a 30-ton vehicle away from a 40-pound explosive charge. They found a ruined, abandoned Case Forte several miles behind the lines for their first test. Harris was in the commander's hatch, Varga at the ready, and Cohen outside, observing from a safe 200 meters. The M32 ground forward, its engine roaring. Harris directed the driver. Easy. Easy. Now. The tank pushed the pipe into the crumbling stone wall. Varga leaned out of the loader's hatch, reached forward with a friction lighter, and ignited the fuse. Fuse is lit. Reverse. Reverse. The driver slammed the transmission into reverse, and the M32's tread spun, digging into the dirt as it lurched backward. The 3 seconds felt like an hour. The tank had managed to move perhaps 15, maybe 20 feet, when the Dragon's Tooth detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. It did exactly what Harris wanted, vaporizing a 10-foot section of the stone wall, throwing rubble and dust 100 feet into the air. The breach was clean, but the proximity of the blast was disastrous. A wave of concussive force slammed into the tank, and a blizzard of high-velocity stone shrapnel peppered the M32's bow. The driver's 2 forward periscopes shattered instantly, the glass turning to powder. A main vision block on the glacis plate, designed to stop machine gun fire, cracked from top to bottom. The tank was not destroyed, but it was mission-killed, blinded, and vulnerable. Harris's immediate superior, Lieutenant Reyes, arrived an hour later to inspect the results. Reyes was a pragmatist who respected Harris's mechanical skill. He walked to the breach, whistling at the size of the hole. Then he walked back and ran a glove over the shattered periscopes. "Well, Sergeant," Reyes said, his voice flat, "you proved the C2 can break the wall. You also proved this is a suicide device. The Fallschirmjäger get a Pack 40 round into you 12 seconds after you stop. Your plan requires you to stop, light a fuse, and then get hit by shrapnel that blinds your driver. It's a failure. Harris argued that it was a prototype, that the principle was sound, but Reyes had to report what he saw. The official report that went up to the battalion commander was lukewarm. Sergeant Harris's improvised breaching device shows potential but is not combat viable. The push delivery mechanism renders the vehicle too vulnerable during employment. Battalion command, already buried in logistics for the next failed push, was even more dismissive. The project was a distraction, a waste of C2 and welding rod. Harris was ordered to cut the cradle off his M32 and stick to his recovery missions. The Dragon's Tooth was dead. Sergeant Harris's unauthorized project might have been forgotten. A mere footnote in a battalion-level report had the tactical situation not disintegrated. On March 28th, Divisional Command ordered a major assault to finally open the Leary Valley. The linchpin of the German defense was a sharp, 90-degree bend in the main highway, identified on planning maps as kilometer 19. This bend was defended by 3 sequential masarine walls and anchored by a stone farmhouse, creating a perfect 3-layer kill zone. The attack was a predictable and unmitigated disaster. The lead company of Sherman's, advancing after a 20-minute artillery preparation, was channeled directly into the sights of the same 75mm PaK-40 that had been tormenting the division for weeks. In the span of 20 minutes, 6 M4 Shermans were hit and destroyed. 4 were brewed up, and 2 were disabled, blocking the route completely. The attack was called off by 9:30. The loss of 6 tanks and nearly 20 crewmen in less than half an hour sent a shockwave through division headquarters. The failure at kilometer 19 proved that the current doctrine was broken. It was this desperation that gave Harris a second chance. The divisional commander, General Ryder, was a cold, demanding officer who was now reviewing every potential solution, no matter how unconventional. Lieutenant Reyes, seeing the carnage, bypassed battalion and sent his own report directly to Ryder's aide, stating that Sergeant Harris's device had successfully breached a 4-foot wall and that its delivery system failure was solvable. A message came back to the Ordnance Depot. General Ryder wanted a personal demonstration in 24 hours. Harris, Varga, and Cohen were pulled from their recovery duties. The general wants a test, Reyes told them. But if you bring him that 3-second fuse and reverse trick, he'll court-martial all of us. You have 1 day, fix it. Harris knew the push concept was dead. The tank had to remain stationary, and it had to be safe. We don't push it, Harris said to Varga. We throw it. The team went to work with a new frantic energy. They needed a propulsion system. In a salvage yard, they found a damaged M2 60mm mortar, its tube and baseplate intact. This was the solution. They cut the bipod legs away and, with Cohen's welder, securely fastened the mortar's baseplate to the flat steel roof of the turret on a junked M4, reinforcing the mount with scavenged angle iron. The tube was angled at a fixed 35 degrees. Next, they had to build the projectile. The 40-pound C2 charge remained the core, but it couldn't be fired from the 60mm tube. It was far too large. Instead, Harris, drawing on a pre-war memory of a construction site rivet gun, designed a spigot. They welded the 40-pound charge into a new, aerodynamic sheet metal canister. To the back of this canister, they welded a 24-inch solid steel rod, precisely machined to the same 60mm diameter as the inside of the mortar tube. The entire assembly charge, canister, and rod weighed 45 pounds. The concept was now that of a spigot mortar. The crew would drop a standard 60mm propellant charge into the mortar tube. Then, they would slide the projectile steel rod down into the tube, resting it on the propellant. When fired, the charge would launch the rod, and the rod would throw the 45-pound charge. Harris calculated this would give them a standoff distance of at least 30 meters. A vast improvement over the 3-second fuse and suicidal reverse. They had a new prototype, but they had 1 day and 1 chance to prove it to a general who had just lost 6 tanks. The demonstration was set for 9 on May 14, 1944, on a quiet section of the front that had been cleared of any known German observers. The atmosphere was one of profound skepticism. General Ryder arrived in his command jeep, followed by his operations officer, and a man who would become critical to the project. Major Kincaid, the divisional ordnance chief. Kincaid was a career officer who understood supply lines and regulations, and he viewed Harris's contraption, a mortar tube welded to a tank turret, with open disdain. The target was a 4-foot-thick masonry wall, identical to the ones that had stalled the division at kilometer 19. Sergeant Harris was in the commander's hatch of the test tank, an M4 Sherman named Anvil. Corporal Varga was inside, acting as the loader for the new device. "Proceed, Sergeant." Ryder's voice cut across the radio net, cold and impatient. Harris ordered his driver to halt the Anvil at a range of 50 meters from the wall. This was the first test, stopping in the open, a sitting duck. Harris felt the eyes of the German Pak-40 crews, even if they weren't there. "Varga, load propellant," he ordered. Inside the turret, Varga dropped the 60mm propellant charge down the tube. Propellant in. Load projectile. Harris and Varga, both leaning precariously out of their hatches, lifted the 45-pound canister. They carefully slid the 24-inch steel spigot rod down into the mortar's tube. Projectile seated, Harris grabbed the firing lanyard, a simple wire Varga had rigged to the mortar's pin. He looked at Ryder's jeep, 200 meters to the rear. He took a breath. Firing. He yanked the lanyard. There was a deep, resonant thump from the mortar. A sound of displaced air. The 45-pound projectile, trailing a faint wisp of smoke, arced gracefully into the air. It seemed to hang for a second, then dropped, striking the base of the stone wall almost perfectly. It traveled 35 meters. For a full, agonizing second, nothing happened. Major Kincaid began to turn, a look of "I told you so" on his face. Then, the 40 pounds of C2 detonated. The result was not an explosion, it was an erasure. A blinding white flash was followed by a deafening shockwave that rolled back over the Anvil and the observers, making the ground jump. The entire 100-foot-long masonry wall seemed to lift vertically for a moment before it vaporized into a cloud of gray-white stone dust and black smoke. When the cloud cleared 30 seconds later, the wall was gone. Where the projectile had impacted, there was now a 2-foot-wide breach of pulverized rock. The path was clear. "Driver," Harris said, his voice shaking. "Forward, slow." The Anvil lurched, its tracks biting, and drove easily through the gap, climbing over the rubble and emerging on the other side. General Ryder watched the entire event through his binoculars, motionless. He lowered them slowly. He did not congratulate Harris. He did not look at the tank. He simply got out of his jeep and began walking toward the breach. The other officers, Kincaid included, followed. Ryder walked through the 12-foot gap, the dust still settling. He stopped and kicked at a shattered piece of foundation stone. He looked at the thickness of the original wall, now visible in cross-section, and then looked through the gap to the Anvil, idling 50 yards away. He turned, his eyes finding his ordnance chief in the crowd. "Major Kincaid." "Sir?" Ryder pointed at the Anvil and its turret-mounted weapon. "I want 2,000 of these." Major Kincaid, the ordnance chief, was in a state of professional shock. General Ryder's order was not a request. It was a tactical imperative. "I want 2,000 of these," Ryder repeated. "The main push for Operation Diadem is scheduled for May 25th. That is in 10 days. Make it happen." The elation from the successful test evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, crushing reality of logistics. Operation Diadem was the long-awaited Allied offensive to break the Gustav line, shatter the German defenses, and finally capture Rome. Ryder was giving his division a tool to win, but he had demanded an industrial miracle. Major Kincaid was now in charge of mass-producing a weapon that, until an hour ago, had been a piece of junk welded to a tank. He, Sergeant Harris, and Lieutenant Reyes raced back to the divisional ordnance depot and laid out the requirements. The problem was immediately clear, and it was not what they expected. They had steel pipe, salvaged from Italian construction sites. They had welders. They had access to C2 explosive blocks. The critical bottleneck, the one component they could not fabricate, was the fuse. The device required a very specific component, the M2A, one pressure-activated detonator cap and fuse assembly. This was a standard, reliable fuse used in mines and booby traps. But it was not something an armored division kept in vast-scale supply. Kincaid put in an emergency requisition to the corps-level depot. The answer came back within an hour, and it was devastating. Total available M2A1 fuse assemblies in the entire divisional sector, 800 units. They needed 2,000 devices. They had less than half the required number of fuses, with no resupply imminent. The project was already a failure, just hours after its triumphant birth. Kincaid, Harris, and Reyes stood over the inventory sheet. "We make 800, Kincaid said, his voice tight. "We make them as fast as we can, and we pray the general accepts that 800 is better than 0. He immediately organized the Ordnance Battalion for a 2-4-hour-a-day production schedule. Welders, mechanics, and ammunition specialists were pulled from their regular duties. 2 teams were established, working 12-hour shifts under blackout tarpaulins, the depot illuminated only by the harsh blue-white glare of welding torches. Harris and Varga were assigned to supervise the assembly, showing the new crews how to weld the 60mm mortar mounts and safely pack the C2 charges. The work was slow, dangerous, and precise. Each projectile's 45-pound charge had to be packed perfectly, and each fuse assembly had to be hand-fitted and waterproofed. By the end of the second day of production, May 16th, the logbook told the story. The total number of completed Dragon's Tooth projectiles, 40. The production rate was impossibly slow. Worse, Kincaid's safety inspectors, testing the first batch, found that 1 in every 10 fuses was failing the initial safety check. The hand assembly process was finicky, and the pressure was causing errors. At this rate, they would be lucky to produce 300 working devices before the May 25th deadline. The 800 fuse shortage was a problem, but the slow, failing production was the immediate crisis. The production crisis was not just about quantity, it was about quality. On May 18th, with the deadline now only 7 days away, Major Kincaid ordered a live fire test of the first 20 production line units. He, Harris, and Lieutenant Reyes took the projectiles to the same range where the anvil had triumphed. The results were a complete disaster. The first projectile was loaded and fired. It flew 30 meters and detonated. A perfect success. The second was fired. The mortar gave a weak thump, and the 45-pound projectile dribbled off the end of the turret, falling to the ground just 5 meters away, unexploded. The third projectile fired, but traveled only 15 meters, landing short of the target. The fourth was a success. The fifth was another dribbler. By the end of the test, 5 of the 20 projectiles had failed to launch properly, either falling short or barely clearing the tank. This was not a 1 in 10 fuse problem. This was a 1 in 4, or 25% launch failure rate. It was operationally suicidal. A 25% chance of dropping a 40-pound C2 charge at your own feet was not a weapon, it was a catastrophic liability. Kincaid and Harris were horrified. They spent 3 hours disassembling the failed rounds and the 60mm mortar launcher, and they found the flaw. It was not the projectile, it was the propellant. The standard 60mm mortar propellant charge, the small silk bag disc that dropped into the tube, was designed to launch a 3-pound mortar shell. Harris's team was asking it to launch a 45-pound spigot projectile. The 1:5-to-1 weight difference meant the propellant was performing at the absolute limit of its physical capacity. Worse, the propellant charges, which came from different manufacturing lots, were inconsistent. Some were hotter and worked, while others were weaker and failed. The project was about to be canceled. They had no way to mass-produce a new, standardized, hotter propellant charge in 7 days. The ordnance team, desperate, fell back on a manual solution. They began tearing open the existing 60mm charges and hand-rolling new ones, combining the powder from 2 charges into one new, hand-stitched silk bag. This was a hideously slow, dangerous process, more akin to 18th century artillery than 20th century warfare. It reduced their production of finished, usable projectiles to less than 20 per day. The deadline was a joke. That night, Harris, exhausted and covered in black powder residue, sat in the depot. He was trying to think of where to get more power. The 60 millimeters was too weak. What was stronger? The 81 millimeters mortar. The 81 millimeters mortar used a much larger propellant charge, designed to throw a 7-pound shell. He remembered his recovery missions near the Anzio beachhead. In the chaotic days of the breakout, he remembered seeing entire crates of 81 millimeters mortar ammunition, abandoned and half-buried in a field-expedient ammo dump that had since been overrun and was now behind their lines. He found Lieutenant Reyes. "Sir, I think I know where to get the propellant we need. But it's at Anzio, in the old dump at grid 409er. Reyes looked at him like he was insane. The dump was 30 kilometers away, through unsecured roads, and was almost certainly booby-trapped or pre-sighted by German artillery. You want to go on a salvage run for ammo that might not even be there? It's the only chance we have, Harris said. The hand-rolling will fail. This is the only way. Reyes paused, then grabbed a dispatch form. He authorized a single jeep and a 1.5-ton truck for Sergeant Harris. If you are not back in 12 hours, Reyes said, I'm reporting you both as AWOL, and watch for mines. Harris and Varga drove the 30 kilometers to the Anzio dump in a state of high-strung tension, the jeep's engine whining. The route was technically secure, but secure in the Italian campaign meant it was only shelled intermittently. They passed burned-out panzers and the wreckage of a recent skirmish. The ammo dump at grid 409er was exactly as Harris remembered. A chaotic, muddy field where crates of ammunition had been hastily dropped during the breakout and forgotten. For 2 hours, they searched, moving with extreme caution, well aware that retreating Germans often left anti-personnel mines in abandoned supply depots. They found crates of 30 caliber rounds, useless 20 millimeters casings, and waterlogged artillery propellant. Then, Varga hit a half-buried crate with his boot. It was marked 81 millimeters. Mortar. M43. A1. It was a gold mine. The 81 millimeters propellant charges, larger, more powerful, and packaged in waterproof containers, were pristine. They worked for another 3 hours, loading the 1.5-ton truck with every crate they could find. By the time they raced back to the depot, they had 1,600 M43. A1 propellant charges enough to solve the launch problem for almost the entire production run. They arrived to find the ordnance depot in a different kind of crisis. The production line had hit its 800-unit limit for the M2A1 fuses. Major Kincaid had 800 projectiles finished, but the line was now cold. The deadline was 5 days away, and they were 1,200 units short of General Ryder's order. Just as Harris was reporting his success, a jeep from the 31st Engineer Battalion splattered into the depot. A young engineer, Captain, hearing Kincaid's all-call for any kind of detonator, had brought something. His men, clearing unexploded ordnance, had been salvaging German mortar rounds. He had a crate of 400 captured German impact fuses. The markings identified them as W Zunder, a standard, reliable impact fuse used on German 80 millimeters mortars. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. The welders, the fuse fitters, and the propellant packers worked in 24-hour shifts. The new, stable, 81 millimeters propellant worked perfectly. The adapted German fuses, while slow to build, passed every safety test. The production rate, which had been a miserable 20 units per day, skyrocketed. They were now completing 150 finished, tested, and reliable units every 24 hours. They would not hit 2,000, but they would get close. At 5:45 on the morning of May 25th, 1944, the entire front south of Rome erupted in a deafening, rolling thunder. Operation Diadem began with a barrage from over 1,000 Allied artillery pieces, a storm of high explosives that tore into the German positions along the Gustav line. For 45 minutes, the ground shook. At 6:30, the barrage lifted, and the 1st Armored Division began to move. Sergeant Leo Harris was not in his M32 recovery vehicle. He was riding in the commander's hatch of Lieutenant Reyes's command tank, part of the lead company. He was there as a technical advisor, but in reality, He was there to watch his invention either succeed or fail in the crucible of its first battle. The lead company, consisting of 12 M4 Shermans, approached the infamous Kilometer 19 bend. This was the same piece of terrain that had cost them 6 tanks and 20 men in 20 minutes just weeks before. The air was thick with the smoke of the barrage, but the Masserine walls and the stone case forte were still standing, their dark shapes looming through the haze. The German Fallschirmjäger were waiting. The moment the Shermans came into view, the air was split by the distinctive crack of an 81mm mortar, followed by the rapid thud of an MG-42 machine gun. The lead tank halted 50 meters from the first terrace wall. It was Anvil, the original test tank, now commanded by Sergeant Varga, the man who had helped pack the first C2 charges. Anvil. Fire device. Reyes ordered over the radio. On the turret of Anvil, the crewmen were already in motion. The 45-pound projectile was loaded. The spigot rod slid home. Device ready. Varga's voice came back. Fire. With the now familiar thump of the 81mm propellant, the projectile arced out, struck the base of the 4-foot-thick stone wall, and detonated. The explosion was immense, a flash of white and a shockwave of pulverized stone. A 1-2-foot-wide breach was instantly carved into the wall. Anvil, move! Reyes shouted. The Sherman roared forward, its tracks churning, and was through the gap in less than 30 seconds. A German machine gun that had been firing from the wall's flank was silent, its crew annihilated by the blast. Next tank, hit the left flank, Reyes commanded. The second tank in the column moved up, halted, and fired its own dragon's tooth at the adjacent wall section. A second breach, a second cloud of stone dust. The tank was through. This was the new tactic. It was not a slow advance. It was a percussive, violent, and rapid breach. The tanks were not being channeled. They were making the channels, punching their own holes. The German Pak-40 crew in the distant farmhouse, who had been waiting for the Shermans to expose their side armor, was now faced with a tactical nightmare. The tanks were not following the road. They were coming straight through the terraces, emerging in unpredictable locations, their 75mm guns already firing. The 12-tank company, which had been hopelessly trapped by this terrain, now tore it apart. They breached the first Masserine wall. They advanced 100 meters, halted, and breached the second. They advanced again, and breached the third. The entire action, from the first shot by Anvil to the moment the last tank cleared the third terrace line, took less than 15 minutes. A defensive system that had held the 1st Armored Division for weeks had been rendered obsolete in the time it took to smoke a cigarette. The elation of the breakthrough was real, but it was not clean. The German Fallschirmjäger were professional, veteran soldiers, and they adapted with lethal speed. They had been trained to kill tanks that were climbing or channeling. Now, they were faced with tanks that stopped, fired a new weapon, and then punched through. They immediately identified the new, fleeting moment of vulnerability. From the halt order to the projectile striking the wall, the dragon's tooth firing sequence took approximately 10 seconds. During those 10 seconds, the Sherman was a stationary target. It was a tiny window, but for the expert crews of the Pak 40 seconds and the 81mm mortars, it was enough. The first combat failure was reported at 8:15, as 2nd Platoon was breaching a new line. A Sherman, call sign Charlie 4, halted and fired. The crew waited for the explosion. Nothing happened. The projectile, one of the units fitted with a finicky German W-Zunder fuse, was a dud. It sat, inert, at the base of the wall. We have a misfire. Driver, reverse. The tank commander, a sergeant named Petroselli, yelled over the radio, but it was too late. The tank had been stationary for more than 15 seconds. A German Pak-40, which had been waiting for this exact moment, fired a single armor-piercing round. The 12-second response was terrifyingly fast. The round struck Charlie 4 on the glacis plate, penetrating the armor. The radio went silent. 2 of the crew, including Petroselli, were killed instantly. The tank, disabled and burning, now blocked the lane for its platoon. A second failure occurred 20 minutes later, highlighting a different, unforeseen problem. A tank from 3rd Platoon fired its device at a seemingly standard masarine wall. However, this particular wall had been reinforced by the farmer with buried steel fence posts. The 45-pound projectile, which used an impact fuse, struck one of these hidden posts and detonated early, just 2 feet from the tank's bow. The 40-pound C2 explosion did not breach the wall, but it enveloped the Sherman in a massive concussive blast. The tank commander, who was observing from his open hatch, was struck by shrapnel from the projectile's own casing. He was severely wounded, and the tank's periscopes and main gun sight were shattered by the force of the blast. The tank was blind and out of the fight. Sergeant Harris, monitoring the company and battalion radio nets from Reyes's tank, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was hearing the reports, marking each one on his map. Breach successful, breach successful, breach successful. We have a dud. Charlie 4 is hit. He kept a mental tally. For every dozen successful breaches, it seemed one was failing either a dud, a premature detonation, or a miss. By 10, he had enough data for a rough calculation. The failure rate was not the 25% he had feared from the propellant tests, but it was not 0. It was somewhere between 6 and 8%. 6 to 8 times out of 100, a crew would halt, fire, and either nothing would happen, leaving them exposed, or the device would fail catastrophically. The 92% success rate was a miracle, but Harris was now forced to calculate the human cost of that remaining 8%. The 6 to 8% failure rate was a brutal tactical cost, but it was completely overshadowed by the strategic victory. The 92% success rate was high enough. It was a war-winning number. The Dragon's Tooth did not just allow the 1st Armored Division to advance, it allowed them to shatter the German line. The Fallschirmjäger defenses were based on the assumption that the masarine walls were impassable anchors. By 15 that afternoon, less than 8 hours after the first breach at kilometer 19, lead elements of the 1st Armored Division were 6 miles past the masarine line and racing toward the open ground of the Leary Valley. The math of the victory was stunning. Divisional planners had projected that breaking this defensive line would take a minimum of 5 days and cost approximately 80 to 100 tanks. Instead, the breakout had taken just 8 hours. Total tank casualties for the 1st Armored Division on May 25th were 14, 2 of which were the direct result of Dragon's Tooth failures. This represented a 40% reduction in tank losses compared to the average of previous failed assaults. The road to Rome was now open, and the price had been paid, but the new device had dramatically lowered the cost. The recognition was immediate and came from the top. General Ryder, who had witnessed the failed assault at kilometer 19, now saw his division moving faster than at any point in the campaign. He understood exactly what had happened. Within a week, Major Kincaid's Ordnance Battalion received an official directive. They were to standardize production. The field expedient weapon was given an official, bureaucratic name: Breaching Charge, M3 Harris. Professional draftsmen from the Corps Engineer Battalion were sent to the depot to create formal blueprints based on Harris's and Kincaid's scavenged designs. The M3 Charge, incorporating the 81mm propellant and the dual fuse system, became standard issue equipment for the division's advance. The personal recognition followed a month later. In late June, after Rome had been liberated, a liberation made possible by the breakout on May 25th, Sergeant Leo Harris was ordered to report to division headquarters. In a small ceremony, General Ryder personally awarded him the Silver Star, a medal for gallantry in action. The citation, however, went beyond a single act of bravery. Ryder, in his remarks, did not just praise Harris's courage, he praised his ingenuity. The citation explicitly stated that the M3 breaching charge was instrumental in the success of Operation Diadem, and that Sergeant Harris's refusal to accept a tactical stalemate and his innovative solution under extreme pressure were directly credited with saving the lives of his fellow soldiers and the loss of an estimated 200 armored vehicles. The Dragon's Tooth, or the M3 breaching charge, was a weapon born of a specific, desperate moment. The true legacy of Sergeant Harris's innovation was not the 40-pound charge or the 60mm mortar. It was the formal recognition that a non-commissioned officer, using scavenged parts, could solve a strategic problem that had baffled divisional command. That lesson was institutionalized in the 1945 revisions of the Army's field manuals, specifically FM 5-25 explosives and demolitions. New language was added. This doctrine now included sections on field expedient breaching charges, directly citing the lessons learned from the Italian campaign. The concept of using tank-mounted, improvised demolitions to overcome fixed fortifications was no longer a sergeant's crazy idea. It was a formal part of the curriculum. This new doctrine was taught at the U.S. Army Engineer School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Young officers and NCOs were now trained to look for solutions like the M3, to see enemy obstacles, not just as barriers, but as raw materials. Sergeant Leo Harris himself did not see this. He received his Silver Star, served until the end of the war in Europe, and was honorably discharged. He returned to his home in New Jersey, married, and, in a quiet echo of his engineering skill, spent the next 30 years working as a civil engineer. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of the Dragon's Tooth, or the desperate, frantic 10-day production window. The specific device was forgotten. The M3 Harris became a footnote in ordnance history, but the principle endured. Decades later, in the mountains of Afghanistan, A.U.S. Army Combat Engineer Team would be faced with a new kind of case forte, a Taliban-held compound made of thick, 10-foot-high mud and stone walls, impervious to machine gun fire, and resistant to light mortars.